The storm didn't knock. It roared. Snow flung itself sideways across the frozen sky, smashing into the rugged sides of Liam's cabin with a relentless, furious rhythm. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, sharp and shrill, like an ancient beast clawing at the very foundation of his existence. The cabin creaked, groaned, as if it too was holding on, unwilling to let the storm tear it apart. The air was thick with cold, the kind that seeped into bones, into thoughts, and clung to every inch of the walls like an uninvited guest. Inside, the heat core buzzed faintly, its hum the only steady sound amid the chaos outside. The firelight flickered in the hearth, its orange glow painting shadows on the stone walls, dancing like ghosts that had long since forgotten their names. Liam sat hunched by the burner, his broad shoulders tense, hands calloused and worn, fingers wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. He didn't drink it. He rarely did. The tea was just something to hold, something to occupy his hands while the silence did its work. Out here, in the endless white of Arctara, silence wasn't peace. It was weight. He'd come to the edge of known space for that silence. Begged for it. After the war, after what he had seen and done, noise only reminded him of orders, screams, gunfire, the gut-deep rumble of collapsing bunkers. Silence was the only thing that didn't scream back. But tonight, even the silence felt oppressive. The storm outside roared like it was trying to devour everything, even the quiet, pressing down on him harder than usual. The stillness inside the cabin, once his refuge, felt too heavy to carry. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the weight of his memories was pulling him deeper into the shadows. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, his thoughts drifting back to that time, before he had come here, before the war had taken everything. Liam had been a soldier, a man who had lived on the edge of chaos for as long as he could remember. He had been trained to survive, to endure, to fight until his body gave out. But somewhere along the way, the man he used to be had disappeared, replaced by someone who didn't know how to live in peace. After the war, after everything had been burned down, he had chosen this planet, this cabin, as a place to disappear. A place where no one would find him. A place where the world outside couldn't reach him. But as the storm howled, as the wind shrieked through the cracks in the walls, Liam realized that the past had followed him. The silence he had craved so desperately had turned into a prison, and the ghosts of his past roamed freely inside his mind. Every crack in the walls, every gust of wind, carried with it a memory, a flash of the things he had done, the people he had failed. He hadn't come here to find peace, he had come here to forget. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on his chest. His mind drifted back to the war, to the faces of men and women who had died in his arms, to the screams of soldiers falling in battle, to the endless noise of gunfire and explosions. Those memories had been etched into his soul, impossible to erase. But here, in the stillness of the cabin, in the cold silence of Arctara, Liam had hoped to find a way to silence the noise. To finally, after all these years, find some kind of peace. But now, in the oppressive stillness of the cabin, he understood that the silence wasn't the answer. It was just another kind of noise, another way for his mind to replay the memories, the mistakes. The silence had become a mirror, reflecting back the things he had done and the things he had lost. And as the storm raged outside, Liam realized that no matter how far he ran, he could never escape what was inside him. He leaned forward, his fingers tightening around the cup of tea, the heat from the burner warming his hands. It wasn't the warmth he craved, but it was something. He sat there for a long time, staring into the fire, letting the heat seep into his bones. It was the only steady thing in this world, the only thing that didn't shift and change with every passing storm. Outside, the wind howled again, a sharp, shrill sound that rattled the windows and sent a chill down his spine. He stood up, the creak of the floorboards echoing in the empty cabin. His instincts kicked in, automatic, as they always did when the world outside felt like it was trying to swallow him whole. He grabbed his coat, the weight of the revolver at his side a reminder of the life he had left behind. The door was locked, the storm sealed outside. But something had changed. A knock. Liam froze, his heart racing. Another knock, barely audible over the storm, followed by a dull thump as something, or someone, fell against the door. Instinct kicked in, but this time it was different. This wasn't a threat. This wasn't the enemy knocking. This was something else. A sound he hadn't heard in years. A sound that didn't belong in the silence he had built around himself. He moved quickly now, his mind sharp with the awareness that danger could be anywhere. But this was different. He unlocked the door, cracked it open, and his breath caught in his throat. There, standing against the storm, were three figures. A woman, tall and thin, her skin an icy blue, stretching tight over sharp features. Her long white hair blew behind her, matted with frost. And beside her, two children, small, frail, blue-skinned like their mother, their eyes wide and searching, hungry for warmth. Liam's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He had seen a lot in war, but this was something he couldn't fit into any box. The storm raged around them, but they didn't retreat. They stood there, waiting. The woman spoke, her voice low and strained. "I will warm your bed, human. My children need a father." The words struck him harder than he expected. Not because they were unexpected, he had been expecting them, in some way, but because of the way she said it. There was no pleading, no bargaining. Only exhaustion. Only desperation. It was a quiet plea for survival, a plea he had heard before, but never in this way. For a moment, Liam hesitated, his mind racing. His hand tightened around the doorframe, and for the first time in years, he realized he wasn't alone in this world anymore. There were people who needed him. People who were waiting for something he didn't know how to give. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, something had shifted. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was a beginning. A shift, subtle but undeniable. Liam stood aside, the revolver still clutched in his hand, and let them in. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The weight of the moment was enough. The silence in the cabin had changed, from one of isolation to one of anticipation. The air was no longer heavy with the weight of his past, but with the presence of others. And for the first time in years, Liam didn't mind the noise. The door swung open, but the wind was still there, howling, ripping through the gap with the fury of a storm that would not relent. It pressed against him with the cold, a force as unyielding as the memories that clawed at the edges of his mind. He froze for a moment, the world outside blurred by the snow, only the silhouettes of three figures standing in the blizzard. For a heartbeat, he thought the storm itself had come alive, but no. These figures, two children and a woman, were real. Alive. They didn't move. They didn't flinch. The woman stood in front, her sharp, pale features almost luminous against the swirling snow. The children, huddled close to her, were blue-skinned, fragile, with eyes too large for their small faces. Their hair was a disheveled white, flying like tangled threads in the wind. They were so still, so silent, that for a second, Liam wondered if they were ghosts. But the woman's gaze cut through him, steady, almost expectant, like she had seen this place, this isolation, before. Her eyes were golden, fierce, but tired. She blinked, once, slowly, as if she had long since stopped believing in kindness, but held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, it could still exist. She opened her mouth, her voice a rasp, raw with exhaustion. "I will warm your bed, human," she said. The words were strangled, as if speaking hurt, as if the weight of the world had pressed them from her throat. "My children need a father." The silence between them thickened, and for a moment, Liam didn't know how to respond. The request wasn't a plea for comfort or warmth in the usual sense. It wasn't the voice of someone desperate for shelter. It was something else. Something deeper. A survivalist's plea. She wasn't asking for kindness, she was simply stating a need. Liam didn't know how to process it. He had lived alone for so long, surrounded by his own ghosts, that the presence of these strangers felt like an intrusion. He looked down at the two children, small, shivering, their breaths visible in the cold air that poured into the cabin. The older one, perhaps 6, clutched his little sister tightly. He was trying to shield her from the wind, from the storm, his own body shaking with the cold. But the child's grip was weak, the frost already beginning to take hold. Liam's heart stuttered in his chest. He wasn't a kind man. Not anymore. But even he couldn't ignore the sight of them. The unspoken desperation between the woman and the children was as sharp as the cold wind outside. The boy looked up, his teeth chattering as he whispered in halting common, his words barely audible against the storm. "We haven't eaten for 2 suns," he said, his face pale, lips blue. "But Mama said someone kind would help." Liam felt something twist in his chest. The boy's words, so simple, so innocent, carried a weight Liam wasn't prepared for. He had lived through war, seen death, felt the burn of 1,000 battles. But this, the fragility of these children, the quiet desperation of the woman, was something he couldn't ignore. His hand tightened around the doorframe, the cold metal of his revolver still heavy in his other hand. He should turn them away. His mind screamed for him to shut the door, to leave them to the storm. He didn't owe them anything. He had nothing to offer. But the children's eyes, wide, fearful, searching for something, made his resolve waver. The girl, barely more than a toddler, looked up at him. There were no tears, no sobs, just a simple, direct question. "Do you have soup, mister?" she asked. Her voice was soft, but there was a quiet hope in it. She didn't cry. She wasn't afraid. She was just curious. Liam's throat went dry. He wasn't a kind man. Not anymore. But he couldn't stand there, frozen, watching them shiver in the snow. There was a breaking point, a line drawn in the sand, and this quiet, innocent need, was it. He dropped the revolver, stepping aside to open the door fully. The wind howled in, biting at his face, but he didn't care. "Get in now," he said hoarsely, his voice rough from disuse. The woman hesitated, a flicker of disbelief in her eyes. For a moment, she stood frozen, as though she couldn't believe that he was offering them shelter. But then, slowly, she moved. She gently pushed the children forward, guiding them across the threshold into the warmth of the cabin. They stumbled in, collapsing near the heat core, their small bodies pressed together for warmth. The woman entered last, her movements slow, careful. She ducked her head as she crossed the threshold, but she didn't look at him. She didn't speak. Liam shut the door behind them, securing it against the storm. The cabin was still, silent once again, but this time the quiet felt different. The silence was no longer just his. It was theirs too. He watched them for a long moment without speaking. The children, curled together by the heat vent, their faces still pale from the cold, were trying to warm themselves. The woman, still shaking, knelt beside them, her hands raw and red, the fabric of her clothes little more than rags. Her clothes were mismatched, patched together from scraps. And Liam noticed, too late, the faint bruises on her wrists. She was used to suffering. Used to offering herself in exchange for mercy. He didn't know why she had come to him. She could have gone anywhere. There were other places, warmer places, safer places, where she could have found refuge. But she had come here, to this small, isolated cabin on a frozen world, to him. Liam stood up slowly, his movements stiff, and went to the cupboard. He grabbed a pot of leftover stew and heated it, his mind lost in the hum of the burner. He didn't look at them as he filled the bowls. He handed them out, one by one, to the woman and the children. When it was her turn, the woman took the bowl in both hands, holding it close as though it were a lifeline. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. The act of taking the food, cradling it to her chest, was thanks enough. The boy ate methodically, every motion careful and precise, as though food was something to be rationed, something precious. The girl, Tiva, ate too fast, coughing and choking on the food. Her mother was panicked, but Liam was already there, his hands steady as he handed her a cup of water. "She's okay," he said quietly. "Just too fast." Selene watched him, her eyes flicking over to the girl as she recovered. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. But something shifted between them in that moment. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't charity. It was something deeper. Something unspoken. They were both broken, both survivors in a world that had offered them little but pain. But now, for the first time in a long time, they were sharing something else, something small, something fragile, but real. Liam sat back in his chair, the fire crackling in the hearth. The children, exhausted, had fallen asleep by the heat vent. The woman, Selene, sat beside them, her bowl empty, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest as if the warmth had not reached her yet. She didn't look at him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was as heavy as his own. But Liam understood that silence now. It wasn't isolation anymore. It wasn't the hollow void he had known for years. It was something else. Something shared. He went to the cupboard again and pulled out a blanket. When he returned, Selene was still sitting in the same position, her shoulders slumped. He walked over and placed the blanket beside her, wordlessly. She didn't look up, but she didn't push it away either. For the first time in years, Liam didn't mind the silence. The storm outside raged on, but inside, something had begun to shift. Liam didn't know it yet, but the first cracks in his walls had started to form. And the people in this cabin, these strangers, weren't just passing through. They were here to stay, whether he was ready or not. The silence that had once been his prison was beginning to change. The storm outside hadn't stopped. It was as if the planet itself was in a constant, unrelenting struggle against the inhabitants it had allowed to settle there. But inside the cabin, the air was warmer, though still tinged with the chill of the unforgiving world outside. The heat core hummed in the corner, a faint comfort against the growing tension in the room. Liam sat at the table, the faint glow from the fire casting long shadows across the stone walls. The warmth from the hearth seemed too small for the space, barely enough to reach the far corners of the cabin where the silence still clung. Selene had settled by the heat core with the children, their fragile bodies wrapped in the threadbare blankets Liam had found in the storage closet. The children had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep, their small chests rising and falling in rhythm with the crackling of the fire. Tiva, the younger of the two, had curled herself into a ball, her bare feet still cold despite the blankets. Cello lay next to her, his arm protectively draped over his sister, as though even in sleep, he was guarding her from the storm that still raged outside. Liam watched them without speaking, his gaze lingering on Selene. She was sitting just a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest as though the warmth of the fire hadn't quite reached her. Her eyes were distant, unfocused, staring into the flames. There was a sadness in her gaze, something that had nothing to do with the cold. Liam knew that kind of silence. He had worn it like a second skin for years. It was the silence of someone who had been stripped bare by the world, who had learned not to ask for anything. Not to trust. But Selene didn't need to speak for Liam to know she was still reeling. She was surviving. Just as he had been. Just as everyone in this cabin was. They were all just trying to make it through the storm, trying to survive, one moment at a time. The stillness stretched between them, but it wasn't the kind of silence Liam had grown accustomed to. There was no judgment in it. No emptiness. It was full of unspoken understanding. But even in that silence, there was a gnawing ache, something deeper that neither of them could ignore. Liam stood up slowly, stretching his stiff limbs. The storm outside had worn him down, but not as much as the silence in the room. It wasn't peaceful, it wasn't soothing. It was heavy, full of the weight of decisions that had been made in the past, of memories that refused to stay buried. His eyes drifted to the cupboard where he kept his rations. The leftover stew was gone, and though there were still supplies, it would not be enough for long. He moved to the cupboard and pulled out a pot, preparing another batch of soup. His hands moved with the precision of habit, each action automatic, his thoughts quiet but alert. The storm outside had changed, but so had the dynamics inside the cabin. He wasn't used to company, certainly not like this. And though the need for survival was clear, Liam couldn't shake the feeling that something else was happening here. Something more than just surviving. Selene shifted from her spot by the heat core and slowly made her way to the table. She didn't look at him, but the movement was enough. She was here. Present. Not hiding behind silence, not hiding from him. She was surviving, too. Her eyes flicked to the pot of soup he was heating. There was no word of thanks, no gesture of appreciation. And yet, Liam understood. It wasn't about the soup. It wasn't about the food. It was about the act itself. Sharing. It was the first real exchange between them. He filled 2 bowls and handed them to her, watching as she took hers. She didn't speak, but there was a brief, subtle nod of acknowledgement. The children stirred in their sleep, but the world outside seemed so far removed now, the storm little more than a backdrop to the quiet moments inside. As Selene ate, Liam glanced at the children again. They were so small, so fragile. He could see how much they depended on her, how much they depended on each other. Their survival was tied together in ways that he couldn't understand. He had lived through survival. He had lived through the wars, the battles, the missions that had broken him. But this quiet existence, this shared space, was new to him. His hand reached for his own bowl, but before he could take a bite, a small voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mama," Cello whispered from across the room. His eyes were barely open, but he was awake. He reached out, the desperation clear in his voice. "Is there more?" Liam paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. Cello's question hung in the air, not demanding, but hopeful. He had already seen the boy's careful, rationed movements with food. Cello wasn't asking for much, just enough to stay strong. Without a word, Liam stood and refilled the boy's bowl. Cello, still groggy, looked up at him. His eyes were cautious, measuring. But the moment the bowl touched his hands, something softened in his gaze. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But the silent acceptance in his eyes was enough. Selene finished her bowl slowly, her movements deliberate. When she placed it down, she didn't look at him. Instead, she looked at the children, her gaze lingering on them as though she was searching for something. Protection. Safety. Stability. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost lost in the hum of the heat core. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't much, but the way she said it made Liam pause. It wasn't a thank you for the soup. It was a thank you for something more. For the space. For the safety. For the moment of peace. Something she had never asked for, but now, in this small cabin, it was hers, too. Liam didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned back to the fire, his thoughts a tangled web of emotions that he didn't know how to untangle. He didn't understand the way she had entered his life, didn't understand why he had allowed them in. But for the first time in a long time, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. Full of questions, full of possibilities. The storm outside had softened, but the storm inside each of them, was just beginning to change. The night wore on, and the children fell back into a restless sleep. Liam sat at the table, his mind still moving, still unsure of what came next. He wasn't prepared for the silence that had begun to settle between them, for the change that had already begun. But the truth was, he didn't need to be prepared. He couldn't control it anymore. The storm outside had calmed, but in its wake, something inside him had begun to stir. Something that had been buried beneath years of solitude, beneath years of running, was beginning to wake. And as he sat there, alone with the three strangers who had changed everything, Liam couldn't deny it anymore. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was healing. In the days that followed, nothing remarkable happened. The children woke, ate, played. Selene kept to herself, her quiet presence always near, always watching, but never demanding. Liam still kept his distance, still maintained the walls he had built around himself. But they weren't the same walls anymore. They were different, softer, porous. They were not there to keep others out, but to protect something fragile that had begun to grow inside him. Selene didn't speak much, but her actions, her care for the children, the way she moved through the cabin, the way she respected the silence without making it oppressive, spoke volumes. She, too, was surviving. But she was surviving with others, not alone. And for the first time in years, Liam didn't mind the silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, its soft warmth doing little to dispel the tension that had settled in the cabin. Outside, the storm had softened, but the wind still whispered against the walls, a constant reminder of the world beyond. The world Liam had chosen to leave behind. The world that had shaped him into the man he was now, the man who couldn't quite reconcile the silence inside him with the questions that had started to surface. He sat by the table, the shadows of the flickering fire stretching long across the room, and watched the family in front of him. The children were asleep, their small bodies curled around each other near the heat vent. Selene sat nearby, her gaze distant, her thoughts clearly far away. Liam had seen that look before, the faraway, haunted look of someone who had seen too much, who had been broken by the world and left to pick up the pieces. She was here, in this cabin, in the warmth of the fire, but part of her was still out there, lost to the past. Liam had thought he could outrun the past. Thought that silence, isolation, would bury it deep enough that it would never reach him again. But now, with Selene and her children in his cabin, with their fragile presence filling the air, the past had found a way in. The storm outside had brought them here, but the storm inside him had never stopped raging. Selene shifted, catching his gaze. Her golden eyes were soft, but there was something unreadable in them. Something that told him she wasn't finished with her story, not yet. "You've been quiet," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would shatter something fragile. Too quiet. Liam didn't respond immediately. He just watched the fire, the flames dancing and flickering, as if searching for an answer in their movement. Silence. That was all he had. That was all he wanted. But Selene had already broken through the walls he had built, and now, for the first time, he was afraid of what would happen if he let her in completely. "I used to think that silence was peace," Liam said finally, his voice rough from disuse. "But now, I know it's just the absence of noise. It's the absence of life. The absence of everything." He exhaled, the weight of the words settling in his chest like a stone. There was no comfort in silence. Not anymore. Selene didn't respond at first. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable. Her gaze was steady, calm, like she had seen the ghosts of men far worse than him. She had, after all, survived in a world that had no mercy, where silence was a weapon and where every day felt like the last. But there was something else there in her eyes, something that made Liam feel less like an intruder in her world and more like someone she could understand. "You're not the only one running," Selene said after a long pause. "Everyone runs. We just choose different paths. Different ways to outrun the pain, the memories. Some of us run into the arms of others. Some of us hide." Her words landed heavily between them, but they didn't pierce like a weapon. They were soft, like an invitation. She wasn't accusing him. She was offering him something, a chance to confront the truth he had been running from, to stop pretending that silence could bury the things that haunted him. Liam didn't know how to respond to that. His past was something he couldn't face, not yet, not now. He had lived through it, endured it, and he didn't want to look at it again. But there was something in Selene's voice, in the way she spoke, that made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was time. The war, Liam began, the words coming slowly, like they had to be dragged out of him, each syllable heavier than the last. It broke me. I thought I could save everyone. I thought I could fix it. But I couldn't. And when it was all over, I didn't know what to do with myself anymore. I didn't know who I was. Or if I was still human. Selene's eyes softened. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady, as though she could see straight into him. "Who are you now?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying weight. Liam looked up at her, surprised by the question. Who was he now? He had been a soldier, a survivor, a man who had learned to live with the darkness. But who was he without the war, without the pain? "I don't know," he admitted, the vulnerability of the admission striking him hard. He had spent so many years burying the truth, hiding behind silence, that now, in the face of it, he felt exposed. Raw. "I don't know who I am anymore. I just exist. I survive." Selene's gaze softened even more, and for the first time, Liam saw something else in her eyes. It wasn't just understanding. It was acceptance. She didn't need him to have answers. She just needed him to be real. "You're not the only one who's been broken," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a sorrow that ran deep. "I have. I've lost too. In ways you can't even imagine." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain, and Liam's heart twisted. He wanted to ask more. He wanted to know her story. To understand why she was here, why she had come to him, why she had trusted him with her children. But the storm in his chest had quieted for a moment, and for once, he wasn't sure he was ready to open the door to the past. Not yet. Selene stood up slowly, crossing the room to where the children lay sleeping. She knelt beside them, her hands moving gently to adjust the blankets around them. Her touch was soft, almost reverent, as though she was afraid that one wrong movement would shatter the fragile peace they had found in the cabin. Liam watched her, his thoughts still tangled in the words they had shared. He wasn't sure where they were headed, or even if this connection was something that could last. But for the first time in years, he didn't mind the uncertainty. It wasn't the silence that frightened him anymore, it was the idea of living without it, of facing the past and the future without the walls he had so carefully built around himself. The fire crackled, and the storm outside seemed to soften, the howling winds turning into a steady, gentle breeze. The silence between them was no longer a void. It was a space shared, a space where healing could begin. And Liam understood, at least for the first time in his life, that maybe survival wasn't about running anymore. Maybe it was about facing the past, even the parts he wanted to forget, and letting the world, letting others, help him piece it all back together. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know if he ever would. But as he sat there, the weight of Selene's words pressing into him, he realized that the road ahead didn't have to be walked alone. Maybe, just maybe, he could stop running. The storm outside had tapered off into a constant, mournful wind that whispered against the walls of the cabin, a quiet reminder of the power of nature, of things beyond their control. But inside, the air felt different. The space had shifted. The oppressive silence that had once haunted every corner now seemed full, like the stillness that follows a long-awaited rain, where everything holds its breath, waiting for something to bloom. Liam sat by the fire, his eyes flickering between the flames and the figures huddled in the corner. The children, still curled together by the heat vent, slept soundly now, their breathing even and peaceful, their small bodies warm for the first time in days. Selene sat nearby, her back against the stone wall, her knees drawn up to her chest. The tiredness in her posture was no longer about exhaustion from the storm, it was a deeper weariness, the kind that clung to her bones like an old coat that had been worn far too long. Liam's gaze lingered on her, and he noticed the subtle shift in her. Her shoulders, once stiff with the weight of a world she had learned to carry alone, were beginning to relax. There was a quiet in her now, a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there when they had first met. She was no longer just surviving. She was here. She was present. And for the first time in a long time, Liam realized something had shifted in him too. He stood up, his joints creaking from the tension that had lived in his body for years. The fire still flickered in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. It was late, but sleep wasn't something Liam could easily claim. His mind was restless, churned by the unspoken things he had avoided for so long. The silence was different now, quieter, almost expectant. He moved toward the small cupboard where he kept the rest of the rations. There were a few cans left, but not much. They were running out of food, and Liam knew it. But there was something about the act of preparing, the simple rhythm of taking care of the immediate needs, that made the weight of the world outside seem a little lighter. As he heated up the stew, the soft sound of footsteps behind him caught his attention. He turned to see Selene standing, her posture hesitant, almost like she was unsure whether to approach him. She paused for a moment before speaking, her voice quieter than before, the harsh edge it once carried now gone. "I'm sorry," she said, her golden eyes meeting his. For everything. For the way I came here. For what I've brought with me." Liam didn't move. He didn't know how to respond. He had seen survival before, but he had never seen someone lay themselves bare like that, willing to apologize for merely existing in a place they didn't belong. "You don't have to apologize," Liam said quietly. His voice was rough, but there was a tenderness in it that he hadn't expected. "You didn't bring anything here except yourself. And I'm not asking you to be sorry." Selene nodded, her eyes lingering on him for a moment longer before she stepped closer, sitting down beside him by the fire. They didn't speak. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It wasn't the silence that had once haunted Liam's every step. It was comfortable, settled, the kind of silence that only comes when two people are no longer afraid of being vulnerable with each other. Later that night, Liam woke to the sound of quiet sobs. It wasn't the storm outside that had disturbed his sleep. It wasn't the wind or the cold or the noise of the world trying to tear at the cabin. No, it was the soft, stifled sobs coming from the corner of the room where Selene and the children had slept. At first, Liam hesitated, unsure of what to do. His instincts had always told him to keep his distance, to remain separate, to protect himself from the emotions that came with others. But tonight, as he heard the sound of Selene's grief, something broke inside him. He couldn't stand by and do nothing. He rose from his cot, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight, and moved quietly to where she sat. Selene was hunched over, her arms wrapped around herself as though she was trying to hold in the pain that had been a part of her for so long. "Selene," Liam said softly, kneeling beside her. He wasn't sure what to say, but the words came anyway. "It's okay." Her head snapped up, her face flushed with tears, her golden eyes wide in surprise. She wiped her face quickly, as if she hadn't expected anyone to notice, but Liam didn't look away. He could see the weight of everything she had carried, the years of loss, of running, of being told she was unworthy. I'm not used to this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm not used to being seen. To being cared for. I've had to be strong for so long, for them," she nodded toward the children, her voice breaking. "But sometimes, I don't know how to be strong anymore." Liam didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The weight of her words settled between them, heavy with the truth she had just shared. It wasn't about offering words of comfort or trying to fix the pain. It was about allowing her to feel, to be broken for once, without the burden of having to hold it all together. After a moment, he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a gesture he had ever been comfortable with before, but it felt right now. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Selene," he said quietly. "It's okay to be human." Her shoulders trembled, but she didn't pull away from him. Instead, she leaned into his touch, the grief flowing out of her in quiet sobs. Liam didn't speak again. He just sat there, his hand on her shoulder, offering her something he had never given anyone before, a piece of his silence, a space to heal. The next morning, the cabin was quieter than it had been in days. The wind outside had died down to a low whistle, the snow still thick on the ground, but there was a new warmth inside. It wasn't just the fire that had been stoked and the food that had been shared. It was something deeper, something that had begun to grow between them, a fragile bond of understanding, of mutual care. Selene, though still weary, had begun to open up in small ways. She played with the children, her laughter soft but genuine. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to live again. Liam didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he was ready to face everything that had been buried for so long. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was fighting the storm alone. The silence in the cabin was no longer oppressive. It was a shared space, a space where healing could begin. And though Liam didn't have the answers, he knew one thing: survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about learning to let go. To let others in. To trust. And for the first time, he was ready to take the first step toward that healing, not just for himself, but for the people who had come into his life, uninvited but desperately needed. The healing had begun. The storm had completely receded by morning. The air outside still held a biting chill, but the winds no longer howled against the cabin's fragile walls. The world beyond the windows was a blank canvas of snow, the vastness stretching out in every direction, offering no hints of what lay beyond. Inside, however, the silence felt different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence that Liam had lived with for so long. This was something lighter, something fragile but warm, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through an overcast sky. Liam awoke before the others, as he always did. He sat by the window, staring out at the whiteness. The cabin was still, save for the soft sound of the heat core humming in the background and the occasional rustle of blankets from the sleeping figures nearby. The children, Tiva and Cello, were still curled together by the fire, their small bodies wrapped in blankets, their breath steady. Selene, though, was awake too, though she lay still, her face half hidden by the shadow of the wall, her eyes staring out at the same snowy landscape. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was an understanding, a shared space where neither had to be anything they didn't want to be. They were still strangers in many ways, but in this silence, they were no longer alone. As the day wore on, the quiet routine of their new life settled in. The children woke first, as usual, Tiva blinking her eyes open, her small hands rubbing her face before she leapt to her feet, energetic as ever. She darted to the heat vent, her bare feet barely touching the cold floor before she crouched down, her face close to the warmth. Cello followed slowly, stretching his small limbs, his movements cautious, always aware of his surroundings. Selene and Liam exchanged a glance from across the room as the children moved about, and something shifted. It was subtle, imperceptible, but it was there. Something in the air between them, something unspoken. The weight of the past hadn't disappeared, not entirely, but it had begun to recede, replaced by a new reality, one where they were all in this together. "Papa," Tiva's voice broke the silence, soft and innocent as she turned to Liam. Her eyes were wide, searching. "Can I go outside today? I want to play in the snow." Liam froze at the sound of the word, a part of him tightening in surprise. It wasn't the word itself that caught him off guard, it was the ease with which it came from her mouth, the sincerity behind it. He hadn't expected her to say it so casually, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. But there it was, a word that had never belonged to him before. A title that he hadn't asked for, but one that now seemed to fit him in a way he couldn't quite explain. "You can play outside," he said slowly, his voice hoarse, not out of reluctance, but because the word "papa" still sounded foreign on his tongue. He cleared his throat, then added, "But be careful. Don't wander too far." Tiva beamed, nodding enthusiastically. "I will. I'll stay right here." Liam watched as she scrambled to the door, her excitement so pure and contagious that it made something inside him stir. She wasn't asking for permission to exist in this world. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply being. And in that, Liam found a strange sense of peace. Selene stood up as well, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she too were adjusting to this new life. She walked over to the table where Liam was sitting, her eyes lingering on him for a moment before she spoke. I don't know what this is yet," she said quietly, her voice tinged with something unfamiliar. Was it fear? Hope? Liam couldn't tell. "But it's more than I expected. More than I deserve." Liam didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure what to say. He had never been good with words, never been good at comforting people with his speeches or assurances. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, he realized something: she was right. This wasn't just survival anymore. It wasn't just about getting through the storm. This was something else. Something different. "You don't have to deserve it," Liam said at last, his voice steady, though the words themselves were foreign to him. "None of us do. We just have to live." Her eyes softened, and for a brief moment, she seemed to relax, her shoulders no longer as tense. There was a small smile on her lips, one that didn't hide the pain or the scars, but one that was real as the warmth from the heat core that filled the cabin. "Living isn't easy," she whispered, her gaze drifting toward the children as they played near the door, their laughter echoing through the cabin. "But it's better than surviving." Liam nodded, his gaze following hers. He could see it now, what she was saying. They weren't just surviving. Not anymore. They were living. And that was something he hadn't done in years. The day passed slowly, but there was a different kind of peace in the air. Liam worked on securing the cabin, checking the solar panels, making sure the rations were still intact. It was mundane work, but it was grounding. It kept his mind from wandering to places he wasn't ready to visit yet. Selene, meanwhile, kept herself busy by making sure the children were fed and taken care of. She wasn't the type to sit idly by, even when everything seemed still. She was a mother, a protector, and she moved through the cabin with a quiet grace that Liam had come to appreciate more than he expected. She wasn't asking for anything. She was simply living, and that was enough. As the sun began to set, casting a faint golden glow across the snow-covered world outside, the four of them gathered near the heat core. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the stone floor. The children, now tired from their play, had settled down next to each other, their small hands wrapped around one another, their heads resting against the floor. Liam looked at them, and for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider in his own life. For the first time, he didn't feel like the stranger in the cabin. He was part of this. He was part of them. He looked at Selene, who was watching him from across the room. Her gaze wasn't heavy with expectation. It was full of something else, something lighter. Something that had been missing for a long time. Liam stood up, moving slowly, unsure of the words he wanted to say. But he didn't need to speak. He didn't need to make grand gestures or promises. He just needed to be there. To show them, show her, that this was real. That they weren't alone anymore. He walked over to Selene and sat beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. But the silence was no longer oppressive. It was a shared space, a space where they could just be. And as the fire crackled softly between them, Liam realized that, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. Later that night, as the cabin settled into a peaceful sleep, Liam lay in his cot, staring at the ceiling. The sound of soft breathing filled the room, the children, Selene, all sleeping soundly. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Liam let himself sleep too. He wasn't surviving anymore. He was living. And maybe, just maybe, he had found a new family. The morning broke slowly over Arctara, a pale light filtering through the frost-covered windows, as if the planet itself was waking up from a long, heavy sleep. The snow outside, still thick and untouched, lay like a blanket across the landscape, softening the harsh lines of the world. But inside the cabin, there was a quiet stir of life. The fire, which had been burning low all night, flickered back to life, casting a warm glow over the room. Liam woke to the sound of soft footsteps. Tiva, small and light on her feet, was already up, her bare feet padding quietly across the stone floor as she moved toward the heat vent. Cello was right behind her, though he moved slower, as though the weight of his frostbitten feet still carried with it the ache of every step. The children, though still fragile, were growing stronger with each passing day. Their laughter, once distant and uncertain, had become more frequent, more real. Liam sat up in his cot, stretching his stiff limbs, his eyes following their movements with a soft, unspoken approval. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to hide. He didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, suffocating him in its grasp. Instead, he watched them, these children, this woman, and realized that something had changed. The quiet that had once defined his existence was no longer a prison. It was something that had been shared, reshaped into something new. The storm outside had passed, and with it, something inside him had shifted. The silence no longer threatened him. It wasn't a void to be filled with the noise of the past, it was space to be shared, to be lived in. And he, for the first time, felt like he could finally fill that space. Later that morning, Selene joined him by the window. She didn't speak immediately, just stood there, her hands clasped in front of her as she stared out at the snowy expanse. The sun, weak but persistent, cast a soft glow over the landscape, turning the white world outside into a canvas of possibilities. Liam, still leaning against the wall, glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice low but filled with curiosity. Selene didn't turn to him right away. She stayed where she was, her eyes distant but somehow focused. Then, after a long pause, she spoke. "I've been thinking about the future," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "About what comes next." Liam didn't respond immediately, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he had been thinking the same thing. He had never been one to look too far ahead. In his life, the past had always been the thing that held him captive, the thing that had shaped him into the person he had become. But now, as he stood beside Selene, watching the snow-covered world outside, something inside him stirred. The future, once an abstract, fearful concept, was beginning to take shape in front of him. "What comes next?" Liam echoed, his voice a little louder now, though it still felt like a question he wasn't quite ready to answer. Selene finally turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "I don't know," she said, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "But I think we can build it. Together." The words hit Liam harder than he expected. He had always thought that survival was an individual act, that the past and the future were things you had to face alone. But now, standing here with her, with the children, he realized that maybe he wasn't alone. Maybe, for the first time in years, he didn't have to face it all by himself. The day passed slowly, and as the sun climbed higher in the sky, a sense of calm settled over the cabin. Liam found himself moving more easily through the familiar motions of daily life. The children were outside playing again, their laughter rising above the low hum of the wind outside. Selene had begun to make preparations for the future, too, gathering supplies, checking their rations, and making sure that they were ready for whatever came next. Liam had always thought of survival as a solitary endeavor, a thing that required him to shut out the world, to focus solely on the next day, the next task, the next fight. But as he watched Selene and the children work together, he realized that survival was only part of the equation. What came after, the living, the thriving, the healing, was something that required more than just getting through the day. It required connection. It required trust. And for the first time, Liam felt like he could give that. Not just for himself, but for them. For the family that had unknowingly entered his life and shown him that there was more to life than just surviving. Later that evening, after the children had been tucked into bed, Liam and Selene sat together near the hearth. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. The cabin was quiet now, save for the occasional crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the sleeping children. Selene looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder what the future holds?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam turned his head, meeting her gaze. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. He had wondered. He had spent so many years lost in the noise of his past, trying to outrun the things that haunted him, that he had never stopped to think about what came after. "I used to," he said, his voice low and steady. "But now, I don't think it matters as much. Not as long as we're together." Selene's gaze softened, and she smiled, a small, quiet smile that spoke volumes. It wasn't a smile of victory or triumph. It was a smile of understanding, of shared experience, of mutual trust. "Together," she echoed, her voice full of something Liam couldn't quite define. "That's all that matters." The days passed, and the future slowly began to take shape in the cabin, in their lives. The children grew stronger, their laughter more frequent, their steps more confident. Selene and Liam began to work together, building a life not just of survival, but of something more. Something real. Liam had never imagined a future like this. He had spent so many years running from the past, hiding from the noise and the pain, that he had forgotten what it felt like to live in the present. But now, surrounded by the people who had somehow become his family, he realized that the future wasn't something to fear. It wasn't something to hide from. It was something to build. And as the snow outside slowly began to melt, as the days grew longer and the world began to shift from the cold of winter to the warmth of spring, Liam knew that the future was no longer an uncertain, distant thing. It was here. It was now. And it was something he was ready to face, with Selene, with the children, with his new family by his side. The fire had long since burned down to embers, the warmth in the cabin now a quiet, steady presence. Outside, the world had shifted from the stark cold of winter to the soft light of spring. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of earth that had been buried under ice for what seemed like an eternity. In the silence that followed the storm, something else had begun to grow, hope. It wasn't loud or brash, like the war Liam had once fought, but it was real, slowly and steadily taking root in the corners of the cabin, in the hearts of the people who now called it home. Liam sat by the fire, his gaze flicking to the sleeping forms of Selene and the children. The cabin was still, but the quiet was different now. It wasn't the suffocating silence of a man running from his past. It was a space filled with life, with movement, with the gentle rhythms of a family beginning to heal. The pain of the past was still there, lingering in the shadows of their minds, but it was no longer the thing that defined them. For the first time in years, Liam allowed himself to feel something other than the cold emptiness he had carried for so long. He wasn't sure what the future held. He didn't know if the storm had passed for good, or if another would come, one just as fierce as the ones that had already swept through his life. But for now, in this moment, he knew one thing: he wasn't facing it alone anymore. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Healing, after all, was never a straight path. But what Liam had learned in the days since Selene and the children had arrived was this: survival was only the first step. The real work, the real journey, was about learning how to live again. To open up. To trust. To be part of something bigger than yourself. The storm outside had been fierce, but it had forced them to confront their fears, their doubts, their pasts. And in that storm, they had found something extraordinary: each other. They had built something from the ruins of their brokenness, and though the world beyond their cabin was still cold and uncertain, inside, they had warmth. They had a family. Liam had spent so many years believing that he had to carry the weight of the world on his own. That his scars were too deep, too visible, to be loved, to be cared for. But he had learned, in the company of Selene and the children, that healing didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending the pain didn't exist. It meant allowing others to share that burden. It meant realizing that love, trust, and connection could grow even in the most unlikely of places. As Liam sat there, watching the embers flicker in the hearth, he realized something: the future wasn't a place to fear anymore. It wasn't something that had to be outrun or ignored. It was something to be embraced. And though he didn't have all the answers, though he wasn't sure where this new life would take him, he knew that he had found something worth fighting for. This wasn't just survival. This was life. If you're reading this, if you've made it this far, take a moment to reflect on the story you've just read. Think about the times in your life when you've been broken. Think about the moments where you felt isolated, where you've believed that healing was impossible, or that you were too far gone to be saved. We all have our storms. We all have our battles, our fears, and our scars. But remember this: healing begins not in solitude, but in connection. We don't heal alone. We heal through the people we allow into our lives, through the relationships we build, and through the trust we place in others. Like Liam, we can learn that survival isn't enough. It's about living. It's about finding warmth in the coldest places and allowing ourselves to be part of something bigger than just ourselves. So, I urge you to take that step. Reach out. Connect. Open your heart to the possibility of healing, even when it feels impossible. Like the family that Liam, Selene, and the children built together, you too can build something beautiful from the fragments of your own brokenness. The storm may still rage outside, but inside, there is warmth. Inside, there is hope. And that is where the future begins.